Did you know that Edgar Cayce, America's most documented psychic, gave a startling warning about a mysterious moment deep in the night, 3:33 a.m., when the soul becomes most vulnerable to unseen forces? According to his trance readings, this hour marks a critical threshold when spiritual doors are wide open, for better or worse. I'm about to reveal exactly what Cayce said about this strange time, and why understanding your soul's vulnerability could be the key to unlocking your spiritual protection, health, and destiny. The world sleeps, unaware that something more than dreaming unfolds in that dark silence. Cayce claimed that while the body rests, the soul departs, moving through planes of consciousness, often entering spiritual realms or brushing against unseen entities, both luminous and malevolent. In those early pre-dawn hours, especially around 3:33, the veil grows thinner. He suggested it wasn't random, but a metaphysical tipping point when the soul, untethered and exposed, becomes a beacon to both divine insight and darker influences. You'll learn how the body sleeps, but the soul journeys. You'll discover why certain dreams at 3:33 a.m. aren't dreams at all, but real spiritual experiences. And most importantly, you'll see why failing to prepare spiritually before sleep leaves your soul exposed to entities and influences you may not even believe exist until they touch your life. But before we dive into the documented cases and prophetic warnings Cayce gave, I want to ask, have you ever woken up often around 3:30 a.m., heart racing, feeling watched, sensing something you can't explain? Cayce said those moments weren't imagination. They were signals from the soul. This is Cayce warned. The soul is vulnerable at 3:33 a.m., and what you'll learn in the next few minutes might change how you view every single night of your life. Sleep, for most, is a forgotten exile from consciousness. Yet for Edgar Cayce, sleep was not a shutdown, it was a departure. In hundreds of trance readings, he described the hours of rest not as passive silence, but as the soul's active release from the physical, a temporary emancipation into realms most cannot access while awake. But it wasn't just any moment of sleep that held meaning. Cayce consistently hinted that something singular occurred during a specific window of the night, when the material and immaterial worlds came into closer contact, when awareness could be sharpened rather than dulled, and when the soul, unprotected by the waking mind, was at its most vulnerable. That time was 3:33 a.m. This number, so precise yet strange, has drawn fascination for years. Why not 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock? Why that middle ground, that seemingly arbitrary trio of threes? Cayce's accounts implied that this moment was neither arbitrary nor numerically random. Instead, it represented a moment of balance tipping toward imbalance, of openness becoming exposure. In one of his readings, he described the early hours between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock as the phase when forces not bound by the body's awareness may enter freely, a notion that both mystifies and warns. To Cayce, these weren't mere metaphors. The soul's movement wasn't symbolic, it was real. And so were the dangers and illuminations waiting beyond the veil. Modern science, when examined closely, doesn't entirely conflict with this idea. Around 3 o'clock to 4 a.m., the average sleeper enters one of the deepest REM stages of the night. This stage, the fourth or fifth REM cycle depending on the sleeper's rhythm, is typically the most vivid in terms of dream activity. Cortisol levels are at their lowest, melatonin at its peak, and the brain's limbic system, responsible for emotional processing, is lit up like a storm. Heart rate drops, temperature reaches its minimum, and yet, paradoxically, the inner world becomes more alive than ever. While neurologists describe it as a phase of intense subconscious activity, Cayce went a step further. He believed this wasn't merely subconscious, it was superconscious. He claimed the soul didn't just think in metaphor. It traveled, encountered, remembered, and yet, As if tethered to that inner motion, the clock points precisely to 3:33. The pattern of threes has long haunted esoteric systems. In numerology, the number 3 is associated with divine communication, often representing the trinity of body, mind, and spirit. Repeating it thrice intensifies its potency. In Kabbalistic tradition, 333 is said to represent the opening of certain energetic gates, portals between spheres of consciousness. In Christian mysticism, the repetition of the number is seen as an echo of divine perfection, contrasted with the infamous inversion 666. Cayce, deeply familiar with scripture and spiritual symbolism, wouldn't have overlooked the implication. 3:33 was not just a time, it was a signal. That signal, he explained, marked a threshold. What lay on either side depended on the individual's preparation. For those who had attuned themselves spiritually before sleep through prayer, meditation, or even a conscious desire for divine alignment, the 3:33 hour could become an opening into celestial influence. But for those drifting into slumber, unguarded, burdened by unresolved emotions, or spiritually uncentered, that same hour might bring visitations of a different kind. He warned that spiritual beings, some benevolent, others deceptive, often made contact when the physical resistance was lowest. The soul, in its released state, could receive impressions, visions, even commands, without the filtering defenses of rational consciousness. And often, the person would awaken with a start, disoriented, sensing something had just happened but unable to grasp what. This idea wasn't isolated to Cayce. Long before his readings, ancient monastics observed that the darkest stretch before dawn held particular spiritual potency. Christian monks of the early centuries structured their nightly vigils into watches, often waking at the third watch, roughly between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m., to recite psalms, chant, or enter contemplative prayer. They didn't do this for convenience. They believed this hour to be spiritually charged, when angelic presence felt nearest and demonic forces most restless. Jewish tradition too divides the night into 3 watches, and the third ending at dawn is associated with heightened divine interaction. In the Book of Judges and in Lamentations, references to the watch of the night appear, linking this pre-dawn window with both holy visitation and the anguish of divine testing. Even in folklore, 3 o'clock to 4 a.m. carries unsettling weight. Often referred to as the witching hour or devil's hour, the belief persists across cultures that malevolent spirits are most active in this stretch. Witches, according to medieval superstition, gather between these hours to perform rites, sacrifice, or astrally project. In the 16th century, it was believed that any strange noise or shadow glimpsed during these hours wasn't just a trick of the night, it was likely a spiritual presence. And even in the modern age, countless anecdotal reports describe individuals awakening abruptly at or near 3:33 a.m., often with no known physical cause. They report feelings of heaviness, a sense of being observed, or dreams that seem far too vivid and personal to dismiss. Cayce suggested that these moments weren't random acts of terror or accident. Rather, they were invitations, either warnings or openings, depending on the spiritual state of the person experiencing them. He emphasized the importance of pre-sleep intention, advising individuals to align themselves with divine purpose before lying down. A short prayer, a reading of scripture, or even a directed thought of goodwill toward others, he said, could shape the soul's journey while the body rested. In his view, what we do before sleep doesn't just influence dreams, it maps out where the soul travels. He described the thinning of the veil at 3:33 as a phenomenon both internal and external. Internally, the soul's detachment from the body's needs hunger, awareness, thought allows it to float freer into subtle layers of existence. Externally, the planetary energies, the silence of the world, and perhaps even celestial rhythms come into alignment. Cayce never claimed this thinning could be calculated with mechanical precision, but he believed that spiritual time did not always match physical time, and 333 represented a convergence point when the two briefly aligned. He wasn't alone in this view. Other mystics, from Swedenborg to Blavatsky, described a similar phase when time bends inward, allowing impressions from other dimensions to surface. Many of Cayce's patients reported dreams or nighttime visitations that lined up with this hour. One man, in reading 57541, claimed to have felt a luminous presence touch his forehead during the night, awakening with tears and an overwhelming sense of calm. Another woman, in reading 4529-2, awoke at 3:30 a.m. with what she believed was a visitation from a deceased child, her sorrow transmuted into peace by what Cayce described as a genuine spiritual encounter. Not all experiences were gentle. Several readings detail individuals tormented by recurring nightmares that always began at 3:33, featuring oppressive figures, whispering voices, or the sensation of being dragged downward. Cayce didn't deny these as dreams. He clarified them as encounters, projections of the soul into lower realms, drawn there by unresolved emotional burdens or spiritual imbalance. These stories weren't merely psychological case studies. To Cayce, they were evidence of the soul's nightly pilgrimage, sometimes toward divine insight, sometimes toward shadow. And at the center of that journey, one time stood out like a silent bell in the dark, 3:33 a.m. He urged seekers not to ignore it. Instead of fearing it, he recommended embracing it, preparing for it, and understanding it as a moment pregnant with possibility. Not all who experience it do so consciously, but those who awaken at this time, especially with strong emotional impressions, might consider that something more than the body stirred them from sleep. Because while the body may return to the bed and the mind resume its fog, the soul remembers. It brings back imprints, sensations, echoes of voices, or visions too subtle to fully hold. And often, these fragments contain the very answers the conscious self has sought in waking life. Answers delivered at a time when all walls were lowered, and the soul was open enough to listen. If the veil thins most dramatically at 3:33 a.m., as Cayce asserted, then what passes through that veil, and more importantly, what allows us to pass through it, is not merely symbolic. In Cayce's view, the soul did not hover vaguely or drift without anchor during sleep. Instead, it exited the body in a deliberate, structured way, tethered by something subtle but essential, the silver cord, mentioned in the Bibles, Ecclesiastes 12:6, or ever the silver cord be loosed or the golden bowl be broken. This concept predates Cayce, but was central to his explanation of nocturnal soul travel. He described the silver cord as an energetic thread, extending from the soul's essence to its physical host, allowing communication, sensation, and safe return. Without this cord, the soul could not re-enter the body after its nightly sojourn. More than a poetic image, it was, to Cayce, the living highway that sustained the delicate balance between two worlds. While Cayce seldom used heavy esoteric jargon, his descriptions align remarkably with teachings in theosophy and ancient mystical traditions. Theosophical writers like C.W. Leadbeater and Annie Besant described astral projection in terms of an etheric tether, a shimmering link between the physical and astral bodies. In Kabbalah, a similar idea is expressed through the concept of the neshama, the soul's highest component, which maintains contact with the earthly self during sleep and mystical states. Early Christian mystics like Origen and later the Hesychasts also spoke of a luminous thread or light connecting the soul to God, experienced most vividly during dreams, trances, or near-death ecstasies. Cayce's version was more grounded in physiological analogies. He often emphasized that the silver cord was not simply spiritual, but had functional aspects that connected the endocrine system, particularly the pineal gland, to what he called the patent body or soul imprint. He asserted that during sleep, the soul projected out of the physical shell, still connected by this cord, which allowed it to reabsorb lessons, impressions, and energetic information gathered during the dream journey. But that cord, like anything, stretched too far or frayed by lack of spiritual coherence, could be strained. And when strained, it opened the way for something far more troubling. In several trance readings, Cayce warned about moments when the silver cord weakened or flickered. This didn't imply impending death, as full severance would, but rather a form of vulnerability. At certain times, particularly during emotional upheaval, spiritual confusion, or intense physical exhaustion, the cord, though unbroken, could become thin enough to allow external entities to access the returning soul. These were not dramatic cases of possession, but rather more insidious forms of psychic intrusion. He described it like an open window in a storm. Not every gust is dangerous, but once open, the contents of the room are no longer safe. He spoke of such interference not with fear but caution. Entities from the astral plane, he explained, are drawn not only to light but also to unresolved energy rage, grief, envy, or despair. If a person fell asleep in a deeply agitated state, or without spiritual alignment, that energetic disharmony pulsed along the silver cord like a beacon. Just as lighthouses attract ships, even uninvited ones, so too could the soul's vibrations attract the attention of wandering forces, some curious, some disruptive, others parasitic. In reading 3342-1, for example, Cayce advised a man suffering from frequent, unsettling dreams involving shadowy figures and confusion upon waking. Cayce noted the silver cord in this case was taut but strained, influenced by emotional toxicity and lack of spiritual discipline. The man's soul, he said, was traveling, but doing so without clarity, exposing itself to realms of confusion. He warned that continued neglect of pre-sleep mindfulness could allow external psychic suggestions to infiltrate his thought patterns, eventually influencing his decisions in waking life. Another reading, 5378-2, described a woman who experienced a floating sensation followed by sleep paralysis and overwhelming dread during early morning hours. Cayce pointed out that her silver cord remained intact, but that her conscious fear was attracting forces of a lower vibration which sought entry while she hovered between the planes. He didn't recommend medication or ignoring it. Instead, he prescribed prayer, breathing alignment, and daily acts of kindness, simple practices, but ones that strengthened the soul's coherence and reinforced the protective integrity of the cord. What Cayce seemed to articulate, subtly yet persistently, was that the soul's connection to the body is neither constant nor immune to disruption. Sleep, then, is not a blank slate, but a terrain of spiritual logistics. The silver cord is not simply a passive tether. It is a transmitter, a boundary, a guide rope. And while it protects the sleeper under normal conditions, it cannot operate well under spiritual neglect. Cayce's concern wasn't that most people would die in their sleep due to a snapped cord, but that many would live with invisible influence. Subtle hauntings they'd never trace back to those vulnerable hours of open soul wandering. Across ancient traditions, variations of the silver cord are seen as central to mystic experience. Tibetan Buddhism describes tumo and dream yoga practices, where the subtle body separates during sleep, retaining connection to the physical self through a channel of energy. Indigenous shamanic cultures speak of dreamwalkers tied to their earthly shell by a life string. Across these systems, the message is the same. The journey outward is natural, but it is only safe if there is an intact, protected line of return. Cayce offered something additional guidance on how to ensure the cord's strength. He emphasized the importance of spiritual intention before bed, even something as brief as a moment of stillness. The reading of sacred words, the mental act of forgiveness, or simply directing thoughts toward harmony before sleep could act like insulation. He believed these practices didn't just soothe the mind but electrically charged the cord, making it more resilient and less permeable to astral interference. He also advised attention to posture and breath. Sleeping on the right side, Cayce noted in multiple readings, aided the proper flow of cerebrospinal and glandular energy, which in turn strengthened the silver cord's stability. Breath should be steady before sleep, not heavy from anger or rushed from stress. Every little element, he insisted, shaped the path the soul would take and how easily it could find its way back. None of these practices were framed as mystical rituals. Cayce presented them as hygiene of the soul. Just as the body requires rest and cleanliness, so too does the soul require routine care if it's to travel safely at night and return undisturbed. When asked whether people should fear the process, Cayce's answer was always no, but he added that ignorance invites consequences. The silver cord is not a chain, it's a choice. It remains connected as long as the soul remains committed to light thought by observing the rhythms of sleep, tuning intention before bed, and understanding that even in unconsciousness, the soul remains active. Cayce offered not only a map of how we leave the body, but why. The silver cord may be invisible to our eyes, but not to the energies that gather when the veil thins, when the body rests, and the soul is left alone to navigate the deep. The soul's tethering through the silver cord explains how it moves beyond the confines of the flesh, but where it goes and who it meets was a matter of great concern in Cayce's readings. Beyond the body, but not yet within the heavenly spheres, lies what he called the borderland. It is not a place of punishment, nor is it a celestial realm of perfected beings. Rather, it is a liminal field of influence, a spiritual waiting room, dense with memory, emotion, and human presence. According to Cayce, this is the dimension closest to the earth plane, a subtle echo of our own world where many spirits linger, for reasons ranging from love to confusion, fear to unfinished business. In his view, the borderland is the first place the soul travels upon departing the body during sleep. It mirrors the physical world not just in form, but in sentiment. Those who inhabit it, disincarnate souls, recently deceased relatives, and entities bound by unresolved attachments, remain emotionally anchored to people or places on Earth. It is here that most dream encounters occur, though Cayce emphasized that many of these so-called dreams are actual interactions with beings who exist just beyond the visible edge of waking life. He repeatedly warned that the emotional state of the sleeper determines not just what the soul sees in the borderland, but whom it attracts. A particularly compelling case involved a businessman who, troubled by a string of financial failures, began waking nightly at exactly 3:33 a.m. with vivid dreams of his deceased father. The father appeared at the foot of the bed, speaking in fragmented sentences about investments, partnerships, and real estate, words that made little sense upon waking, but left an eerie clarity. The man, skeptical yet desperate, brought his experience to Cayce. In trance, Cayce confirmed that the father's spirit had remained in the borderland, tied by his unresolved concern for the family's business legacy. The advice, Cayce said, was real, not imagination, and urged the man to record each message and cross-reference them over time. Months later, the man found that patterns had emerged, including specific advice on timing that helped him avoid a costly investment just before a market downturn. This case was not isolated. Dozens of readings described similar nighttime visitations. Cayce explained that because the borderland is a mirror of the emotional world, spirits with strong attachments often return to those with whom they had unfinished relationships. Sometimes, these spirits offer comfort, but other times, They express confusion, sadness, or even resentment, especially if their passing was traumatic or their identity still tied to earthly expectations. He emphasized that interaction with borderland entities could be healing or disruptive, depending entirely on the consciousness of the living soul receiving them. Another well-known case involved a woman who had suffered from repeated, disturbing dreams of a young girl weeping in a garden. The dreams were always the same. The girl would call her name, reach out with one hand, and dissolve into tears before fading into mist. This pattern haunted her for over a year. Medical intervention did nothing. Therapy, meditation, even moving homes changed nothing. Eventually, she turned to Cayce. In trance, he revealed that the girl was her twin stillborn and never known to her. The spirit had remained in the borderland, trying to establish connection. Her grief, though unknown consciously, was buried in the woman's energetic field. Cayce guided her through a series of intentional rituals to acknowledge and release the spirit, allowing the soul of the twin to move forward. The dream stopped entirely within a week. Cayce explained that sleep offered one of the few states in which people could truly perceive the borderland without the filtering mechanisms of the ego. The soul, untethered from language and logic, could recognize and respond to subtle emotional energies that usually go unnoticed. These energies sometimes coalesced into full-blown interactions with spirits, some known, others strange. The borderland, according to Cayce, was not only populated by individual spirits, but occasionally by collective entities, echoes of places, ancestral groups, or clouds of consciousness that formed around shared emotion or memory. The soul drifting through this terrain could brush against these clouds, absorb impressions, or even carry them back into waking life. Importantly, Cayce did not present these experiences as supernatural intrusions. He considered them natural functions of a spiritually dynamic universe. Just as two people in a room can feel one another's tension without words, so too can souls resonate across dimensions, particularly in the borderland, where thoughts and feelings are not hidden behind flesh but radiate in full. He emphasized again and again that recognition of this realm should bring responsibility, not fear. He also warned, however, that the borderland could become a trap for the living if not understood properly. If the sleeper allowed fear, obsession, or guilt to dominate their thoughts before bed, the soul could become entangled with spirits in a shared emotional loop. One reading told of a woman who repeatedly encountered the same shadowy man during sleep, always weeping beside a river. Cayce traced this figure to a soldier who had died near her ancestral land during a violent war, his soul lost in a cycle of grief. Because the woman carried generational trauma from that same event, though she knew it only vaguely, her soul met his nightly, caught in that historical echo. Cayce instructed her to hold him in prayer, to send conscious light during sleep preparation, and the visitations gradually ceased. Throughout these accounts, one truth echoed: the borderland is not a place one stumbles into randomly. It is drawn by resonance. Our thoughts, emotions, and beliefs act as magnetic frequencies, and the borderland is highly reactive to such frequencies. Thus, Cayce encouraged individuals to purify their intent before bed, to forgive, to center the heart, and to be aware that souls, ours, and others continue to feel even when the eyes are closed. He described the borderland as the realm most subject to change. Unlike higher spiritual planes, where energies are ordered and harmonized, the borderland is full of flux. Time bends, places change shape, and spirits often appear in the form they held most closely in life. This mutability allows for transformation, but also chaos if approached unconsciously. Cayce saw this realm as a place where healing could begin, both for the sleeper and for the disincarnate, but only if the interaction was approached with clarity and compassion. Above all, he reminded seekers that every soul is capable of light. Even those who linger, confused, or restless, do so not because they are evil, but because they have forgotten how to return. Sometimes, a sleeper with an open heart can become a lantern in the borderland, reminding a lost spirit that the path home still exists at the borderland. Though charged with emotional intensity and unfinished echoes, is not the deepest layer encountered during nocturnal soul travel. Beyond it lies a realm far more volatile. One Cayce warned against visiting without spiritual armor. This is the lower astral plane, a domain not populated by wandering souls seeking connection, but by energies that thrive on disarray. While the borderland might reflect back emotional truths and unresolved relationships, the lower astral magnifies distortion manifesting parasitic entities that feed on vulnerability and project illusion. Cayce's readings made clear distinctions between realms of spirit. The higher planes were marked by light, harmony, and divine resonance, while the lower astral, though accessible, was steeped in confusion and deceptive power. Souls did not merely fall into these regions, he explained. They were drawn in through resonance. Anger, fear, bitterness, obsession. These emotional states, if carried into sleep without resolution, acted as a beacon. And unlike the borderland, where spirits might reach out in sorrow or memory, the inhabitants of the lower astral often approached with a calculated intention to feed, to deceive, and sometimes to influence. He repeatedly warned that astral travel, though natural, was not neutral. Just as one would not explore an unfamiliar wilderness without preparation, Cayce insisted that spiritual discipline must precede any attempt to engage the soul's outward movement. This was particularly vital during the early morning hours when, as established, the thinning of the veil allowed for freer movement and freer intrusion. In those vulnerable hours, especially around 3:33 a.m., the unguarded soul could become a lantern not only to benevolent guidance, but to manipulative forces waiting in the lower dimensions. A 1938 case illustrated this starkly. A man in his late 30s, a self-taught metaphysical experimenter, had been attempting astral projection using techniques drawn from occult manuals. He kept detailed journals, fasted, and even adjusted his sleep cycles to increase the likelihood of separation. At first, his experiences were benign. He described floating sensations, sudden flashes of landscapes, and hearing distant voices. But after several weeks, his nightly excursions became harrowing. He reported waking in paralysis, feeling an oppressive weight on his chest, and seeing shifting, shadow-like figures in the corners of his room. His dreams, once lucid and uplifting, turned dark, filled with mocking voices, impossible geometry, and scenes of emotional collapse. When Cayce was consulted in trance, he described the man as having opened the centers without guarding them, exposing himself to entities that existed not to teach, but to drain. He explained that these lower astral beings often presented themselves in familiar forms, even using the voices of loved ones to confuse the soul during its journey. They fed on emotional reaction fear, especially, and lingered as long as the vibrational match was sustained. In this case, the man's ambition outpaced his spiritual grounding. His mental desire for exploration had not been balanced by purification or prayer, leaving his soul exposed. Cayce's instructions were clear. Cease all projection attempts. Engage in regular spiritual reading. Restore physical and emotional balance. And cleanse the sleeping space with prayer and focused light. Over time, the disturbances abated. This concept of entities deceiving through mimicry was echoed in many readings. Cayce noted that lower astral forces rarely appeared in grotesque form unless provoked. More often, they wore the mask of the familiar loved ones, guides, or even elevated teachers. The deception was not theatrical, but strategic. These beings, he explained, were not omnipotent. They operated by suggestion. If the soul believed them to be wise or trustworthy, they could implant false messages, shift emotional states, or drain vitality subtly over time. Some of Cayce's clients reported feeling inexplicably tired upon waking, emotionally irritable, or experiencing a decline in mental clarity despite restful sleep. He often traced such symptoms not to physical ailments, but to nocturnal entanglement with these hidden presences. Cayce frequently emphasized that these lower astral forces had no authority of their own. Their power depended entirely on the sleepers. Receptivity. He drew an analogy to infection. Just as a weakened immune system allows for illness to take root, so too does a weakened spiritual field allow astral parasites to latch on. What weakens that field? According to Cayce, it is often unresolved emotion, rage not forgiven, grief left unexpressed, desires twisted into obsession. These become doorways, tiny tears in the aura through which suggestive forces may enter. And during sleep, when the conscious guard is lowered, those forces find their opportunity. Preparation, then, was not merely beneficial, it was essential. Cayce advised against falling asleep in states of agitation or distraction. The final thoughts before bed, he said, were the keys to the temple. They shaped the soul's direction, its protective field, and its susceptibility. A person who fell asleep after reading sacred text, praying with humility, or practicing forgiveness entered the dream realm under a kind of grace. One who collapsed into unconsciousness after hours of emotional turmoil or mental dissociation entered without direction, and it was in that aimless drifting that trouble found its foothold. He made clear that the spiritual realm responds to intention. It is not hierarchical in the human sense, but vibrational. What one holds in the heart before sleep sends a signal outward, and entities of matching resonance respond. The higher realms require invitation, humility, love, a desire to serve. The lower, however, require only the echo of pain. They are not evil in the mythological sense, but distorted fragments of consciousness untethered from the source. Drawn to those still anchored in shadow dot in another reading, Cayce described a woman who had nightly dreams of being chased by dark figures through endless corridors. The terror she felt upon waking was paralyzing. Doctors dismissed it as anxiety. Cayce did not. He identified the dreams as partially symbolic but rooted in real astral contact. The entities were not demons, but fragments, what he called thought forms unredeemed. Her fear, unresolved since childhood trauma, made her vulnerable. Through consistent practice, affirmations before sleep, deep prayer, and forgiveness work, she slowly changed the nature of her sleep encounters. The corridors began to fill with light. The chasing stopped. These stories were not rare in Cayce's files. They were patterns, and the message was clear. Soul travel without grounding invites distortion. Curiosity, while noble, must be matched by reverence. He did not discourage spiritual exploration, far from it, but he insisted on preparation. And always, the most overlooked. Preparation was emotional clarity. Because the lower astral does not have access to the soul's essence, it can only attach to its residue. The bitterness not released, the guilt not healed, the anger not resolved. These create hooks. And when the soul separates at night, still attached to those unresolved vibrations, the beings that wait in shadow find a place to cling. But just as easily, the light of peace, compassion, and prayer causes them to scatter. They cannot withstand. True love, not sentiment, but the energetic force of alignment. Cayce's guidance, then, was never rooted in superstition. It was practical, rooted in spiritual law. Shielding oneself wasn't about ritual or magical defense. It was about honesty. Being emotionally honest, spiritually attentive, and lovingly aligned before sleep meant walking into the night with the light on. And in that light, no hidden presence could remain hidden for long. Yet despite the warnings about these unseen forces and the shadowy layers that surrounded the soul's path through sleep, Cayce consistently emphasized that none of these threats were beyond human influence. The key, he insisted, lay not merely in shielding through prayer or rituals performed in fear, but rather in the quiet preparations made before the eyes closed, those last subtle thoughts that shape the direction, clarity, and safety of the journey ahead. It was here, in the moment between conscious surrender and spiritual detachment, that the soul received its orientation. The destination of its voyage, the beings it would encounter, and the guidance it might receive were not determined arbitrarily, but were silently magnetized by the character of the final waking thoughts taught in many of his readings. Cayce described the period before sleep not as mental downtime, but as a gate and interface through which either lower or higher spiritual influences could be invited. He described thought as a kind of spiritual blueprint, constructing a scaffolding along which the soul would ascend or descend. Those whose final thoughts before sleep were consumed with resentment, fear, lust, or worldly attachments were essentially tuning themselves to realms aligned with those emotions. By contrast, those who cultivated compassion, spiritual longing, or forgiveness were adjusting the frequency of their inner being to match planes of clarity, harmony, and divine counsel. Cayce was especially adamant that intention played a determinative role. Thought without desire was inert, but thought imbued with focused intention acted as a spiritual directive. In a 1933 reading for a woman who suffered from chronic night terrors, Cayce advised her to shift her pre-sleep focus entirely, not by pushing away fear, but by replacing it. "Let the last thought be of him," he said, referring to Christ. "Hold the image, not as a picture, but as the feeling, the knowing, the presence." Within weeks, her experiences changed. Instead of the sensation of falling or seeing distorted faces, she reported waking with peace and even receiving symbolic messages that offered clarity on her waking life dilemmas. Such cases led Cayce to develop what he termed spiritual hygiene, simple but powerful disciplines meant to prepare the mind and spirit for clean separation from the body and contact with constructive forces. The first was deliberate nightly prayer, not as rote recitation, but as a personal act of attunement. He encouraged individuals to speak their prayers aloud or silently, but always with sincere emotional weight. It was this sincerity, Cayce believed, that resonated through the soul realms and served as a signal to guiding forces. The second discipline was aligning oneself with a spiritual ideal. Cayce often asked clients to choose a singular word or figure that embodied their highest aspirations: Christ, patience, love, service, and to concentrate on that essence before drifting into sleep. He claimed that this process functioned like a compass for the soul, giving it a direction amid the formless currents of the astral realm. In one session, a man troubled by confusion and despair was told to visualize the concept of cooperation as a living force. In subsequent weeks, his dreams brought him into contact with luminous beings who offered clear steps for repairing his strained familial ties. The man later reported that it felt less like dreaming and more like entering a school of correction. Each night, guided by something beyond himself, another method Cayce endorsed was what he called dream incubation. The idea was that by planting a specific question or spiritual request in the mind before sleep, one could prompt the subconscious, or more accurately, the higher self, to retrieve answers or experiences during the night. The effectiveness of this technique hinged on framing the question sincerely and spiritually, rather than egotistically. Instead of asking, "Will I get the job?" a person might ask, "What must I become to serve in the right place?" Cayce insisted that the soul already possessed access to all needed guidance, but it responded only to humility and purpose, not to manipulation. There were numerous documented cases in which this method produced astonishing results. In one, a young woman facing a medical crisis asked nightly for guidance. Over a period of several days, she received dreams featuring symbols: a snake, a burning bush, and a clear lake, each of which Cayce interpreted as affirmations of healing, renewal, and inner cleansing. Her symptoms subsided shortly after, and Cayce later remarked that the healing had occurred not through the dream itself, but through the soul's alignment with higher order during the dream state. What remained consistent across all such examples was Cayce's insistence that the metaphysical world was never random. The soul, by its nature, was not a passive traveler. It was responsive, sensitive, and deeply shaped by the spiritual temperature of the individual. A single bitter thought, left unchallenged, could color the journey with confusion and shadow. Conversely, a conscious dedication to grace or truth could open the gates to assistance from benevolent intelligences, what Cayce called ministering forces. He likened it to tuning a radio. There were infinite channels broadcasting, but one only received the frequency to which they were tuned. And unlike the physical world, where change might take days or years, the astral world responded instantly to inner shifts. That meant that every night offered a fresh opportunity, not just for rest or escape, but for recalibration. The subtle habits of reflection, humility, and yearning toward the divine were not abstract virtues. They were functional tools for safely navigating the soul's nocturnal landscapes. Even more intriguing were the instances in which individuals, by practicing these disciplines, entered what Cayce described as temples of learning during sleep. These were not mere dreams, but structured environments in the higher astral or spiritual planes where the soul could receive instruction from wiser intelligences. One client, after months of consistent prayer and visualization, described recurring visits to a radiant hall where she was taught through symbols and sometimes spoken words. The insights she brought back helped her found a counseling practice grounded in compassion rather than technique, and she attributed her success to nightly alignment rather than any earthly certification. Ultimately, Cayce taught that the gap between waking and sleeping was not a void but a hinge, a sacred turning point in which the soul could either fall into passivity and exposure or rise into intentional contact with its own divine sources. That rise began not with exotic techniques or esoteric knowledge, but with simple purity of heart in the final minutes of wakefulness. It was the quality of thought at that closing moment, infused with care, clarity, and devotion, that became the soul's armor and its invitation. Once the soul passes beyond the threshold of the borderland and resists the pull of unresolved attachments or negative influences, it may ascend to more rarefied realms of existence. Edgar Cayce's readings describe this ascent as conditional, not automatic. Only those whose spiritual focus had been trained during waking life, and whose intent before sleep was aligned with higher ideals, could breach the lower planes and reach what he referred to as the Hall of Records, the place known more widely in mystical traditions as the Akashic Records. It is not a realm of sensation or ghosts, but of pure memory, a field of consciousness beyond time, where the complete imprint of every thought, action, and emotion from every life is recorded. According to Cayce, during certain stages of sleep, particularly when the soul is freed through the silver cord and guarded by intentional purity, access to this plane becomes not just possible but profoundly transformative. Cayce was not alone in his use of the term Akashic. The concept predates his work by centuries and has its deepest roots in Vedic cosmology. In Sanskrit, Akasha refers to the fifth element, the ether or void that carries all vibrations. From this came the notion of a subtle dimension that acts as a storage field for all knowledge past, present, and potential. Cayce adapted this idea, emphasizing that souls, when correctly attuned, could rise during sleep to receive insights buried in this cosmic archive. But unlike reading a book, the process of soul access is participatory and symbolic. He noted that information often came through images, feelings, or inner instruction during dreams, visions, or sudden moments of knowing upon waking never as direct dictation, but as layered impressions needing interpretation through intuition and inner discernment. He documented numerous instances where clients unintentionally accessed the records. In one case from 1933, a woman came seeking help for her chronically ill daughter, having exhausted all known medical options. Cayce, in trance, told her that the answer would come not through him, but through her own soul's journey. He instructed her to perform a specific pre-sleep ritual, hold a question in mind regarding her daughter's condition, pray with humility and trust, and record anything she remembered upon waking. 3 nights later, she awoke with vivid images of a swampy plant with narrow leaves and purple flowers. She described it in detail and sent the description to Cayce's office. His team identified the plant as blue vervain, known for its nervous system calming properties. After administering a tonic prepared with the herb, the child's condition began to improve within weeks. Cayce later confirmed in a follow-up reading that the woman had, indeed, accessed her personal thread in the records to retrieve a remedy remembered by the soul from another life where she had practiced herbal medicine. Another striking case involved a schoolteacher who struggled with feelings of misplacement in her current life, troubled by persistent dreams of deserts, a ceremonial dagger, and an ancient marketplace. She feared she was losing her mind. In a reading, Cayce assured her that her soul was attempting to make peace with a prior incarnation, where she had once violated a sacred vow. Through nightly prayer and dream journaling, she eventually received what she described as a scroll of understanding during sleep, which laid out the karmic pattern of that lifetime and her current soul contract. The clarity it brought not only quelled her anxiety, but transformed her relationships with students and family. She began to teach comparative religion with a sense of sacred purpose and later trained in conflict mediation. In Cayce's view, such contact with the Akashic field wasn't about prophecy or spiritual spectacle. It was about realignment with the soul's intention across lifetimes. This concept parallels deeply with the Jewish mystical notion of the Sefer HaChaim, the Book of Life, mentioned in the Hebrew Bible and expanded in Kabbalistic thought. There, too, the book is not literal but symbolic of divine memory, God's total awareness of a person's deeds and soul potential. Cayce's use of the records as both a mirror and a map echoes this. Similarly, in Hermeticism and Christian mysticism, there exists the idea that each soul bears its own book or record sealed in heaven, which may be accessed in divine states of prayer, trance, or dream. To these traditions, the soul is not only the reader of the book, but also its scribe. It is important to understand that Cayce insisted such access was not a right, but a responsibility. He repeatedly cautioned seekers not to treat the records as a novelty or tool of divination. Improper motivations such as personal gain, ego, or curiosity without reverence would block entry or attract deceptive impressions from lower realms. This matched warnings in older esoteric systems where only the pure of heart or the spiritually initiated were thought to safely contact divine archives. In Cayce's words, the records respond to the vibration of the seeker's intent, not to verbal commands or ritualistic formulas. He likened it to a tuning fork. The soul must resonate at a certain frequency to match the field of memory it seeks. Crucially, the body's state during sleep played a role in this. Cayce recommended dietary precautions before sleep: no meat, heavy spices, or alcohol, as these lower the vibrational state. He also advised to sleep on the right side to allow the heart to be uncompressed, aiding smoother soul departure and return. Additionally, Specific exercises of visualization, such as picturing light flowing upward from the solar plexus to the crown of the head, were said to assist the soul in ascending toward these higher realms. This echoes theosophical and Kabbalistic teachings where pathways of energy, such as the chakras or sephiro, function as metaphysical ladders for the soul to traverse during sleep or meditation. And though the term Akashic Records evokes vast, impersonal databanks, Cayce insisted the interaction was always deeply personal. Each person's access was unique to their soul's evolution. The records, in his language, were written in the pattern of the soul, and thus were not merely information but living instruction. What one receives from them is not abstract philosophy but moral compass, healing wisdom, and insight into relational dynamics and unhealed inner conflicts. Even more remarkable is how often clients reported that after such nightly visitations, their waking lives changed, sometimes subtly, sometimes radically. A banker left his post to become a counselor. A woman estranged from her father since childhood suddenly knew how to forgive him after a dream encounter. A disillusioned minister rediscovered joy in his spiritual path, not through preaching, but through music. These transformations point to one of Cayce's most enduring beliefs, that contact with higher realms during sleep is not escape, but assignment. The Akashic Records are not simply a library, they are a workshop for the soul. In them, the soul finds not just echoes of the past, but tools for the present and blueprints for the future. And for those who learn to quiet the mind, align the will, and seek not for ego, but for truth, the rewards are not merely insights. They are a return to soul purpose itself. There are moments in Edgar Cayce's trance readings where the tone shifts, where the language, normally couched in the metaphysical but accessible, lifts into something rarefied. These readings often begin with the invocation of the creative forces, a term Cayce used to describe the highest expression of divine intelligence, an origin point for all consciousness. He spoke of this not as a metaphor or philosophical ideal, but as a literal realm of being, a plane of existence beyond the astral or mental worlds, touched only by souls in an elevated state of spiritual resonance. Unlike the borderland, where echoes of earthly attachments linger, or even the Akashic plane, which serves as a cosmic memory bank, the realm of creative forces was pure, unconditioned light, a domain of essence, not form. Entry into this sphere was not granted by desire, ritual, or willpower alone. It required attunement, a preparation of one's entire inner life, and a genuine surrender to spiritual ideals that transcended personal longing. Cayce's accounts of this uppermost realm are fewer in number compared to the more frequented dimensions. But when they appear, they are unmistakable in tone. The language changes, becomes clear, freer of narrative imagery, often suffused with phrases like complete unity, oneness with purpose, and return to source. These aren't just poetic flourishes. In Cayce's schema, this highest spiritual domain was the soul's true home, what ancient mystics might call the pleroma, or in the Vedic tradition, Satchit Ananda, existence, consciousness, bliss. It was here, he claimed, that souls received not only renewal, but also guidance directly aligned with divine will. What is striking in the readings is his assertion that during sleep, certain souls, typically those undergoing intense personal evolution or driven by deep spiritual discipline, could access this plane and return with insights far beyond their intellectual capacity. A striking example of such contact emerged in the case of a woman from Kentucky, a relatively unknown figure, whose case file Cayce dictated in early 1937. She had suffered for years with what doctors misdiagnosed as hysteria. After following Cayce's suggestions for meditation, fasting, and focused dream incubation, she began recording visions that at first seemed symbolic, but soon turned startlingly lucid. In one of these sleep episodes, she encountered what she described as the presence of light within light, a being who offered her no answers, only presence and stillness. In the days that followed, she experienced a cascade of internal shifts. Her chronic anxiety melted away. Long-buried emotional trauma began to surface, and her waking dreams became filled with clear directives on how to forgive her estranged brother, whom she had not spoken to in over a decade. Cayce reviewed these experiences in trance and confirmed they had originated in the realm of the creative forces, calling it a rare attainment, made possible only by a prior commitment of the soul toward service and surrender. In other readings, Cayce implied that the prophetic visions he occasionally delivered, such as eerily precise foresight of the Second World War and his warnings about the shifting magnetic fields of the earth, were not products of the subconscious or even the Akashic field, but rather downloads from this highest realm. The distinction is important. Whereas the Akashic records contain what has occurred or could occur, the realm of the creative forces revealed what should be, from the perspective of divine alignment. In that sense, the creative forces operated not only as a spiritual realm, but as a correctional blueprint for human evolution. Cayce insisted that only by surrendering one's personal ego and embracing a universal ideal of patience, humility, could the soul become transparent enough to receive such instruction. Not all encounters with this realm were thunderous or celestial in appearance. Some were quiet, understated, woven into the margins of sleep, and only later recognized for their profundity. A notable case from the early 1940s involved a young man who struggled with suicidal ideation. Cayce advised a regimen of prayerful silence each night before bed, focused not on asking questions, but on listening to the stillness. Within weeks, the young man began waking with a renewed sense of hope and purpose. In one of his dreams, he stood before a vast and featureless expanse. No voices, no angels, only clarity and a sensation of absolute belonging. Cayce later described the dream as a soul encounter with the creative forces, facilitated not by intellect but by surrender. The man recovered gradually, became a counselor for troubled youth, and credited his healing not to therapy or medicine, but to a whisper inside the silence. The implications of Cayce's teachings here are profound. If the soul can, in its most disciplined and humble state, enter into union with the source of all creation, even temporarily, it means that the human condition is never fully severed from the divine. Unlike religious doctrines that place heaven at the end of life or outside the reach of the flawed, Cayce placed it on the spectrum of nightly possibility. Sleep, when approached with intention and reverence, became the passageway not just to insight or healing, but to the direct presence of God. And while such experiences could never be summoned or commanded, Cayce believed they could be invited. Not unlike the way an open hand welcomes rain, not through force, but by simple readiness. This readiness, however, was not a vague openness. It was a disciplined orientation of the soul. Cayce stressed again and again that only those who cultivated compassion, who bore the fruits of patience in their daily lives, who gave more than they asked, could ascend during sleep to these higher planes. He even warned that to seek access to such realms out of curiosity or personal gain would result in failure or worse misdirection by deceptive forces posing as divine. In this way, Cayce's framework for spiritual exploration stood in sharp contrast to the sensationalist trends of his era. It was not the extraordinary that marked spiritual maturity, but the ethical, the daily, unseen efforts to live with integrity. These, more than ritual or talent, became the ladder toward the creative forces. And while few ever remembered their journeys to this highest realm in detail, the after-effects, Cayce insisted, were unmistakable. People returned changed, not euphoric or enchanted, but softened. Their motives shifted, their attachments loosened, Many found themselves more forgiving, more tolerant of uncertainty, and more drawn to service. These were the subtle fingerprints of contact with the divine. And through these transformations, Cayce believed, the soul not only healed itself, but helped to elevate the consciousness of the world around it, becoming a vessel through which the creative forces could act on Earth. Among Edgar Cayce's most compelling contributions to the study of soul consciousness was his repeated insistence that genuine physical healing could occur not only through traditional material means, but also via spiritual dimensions accessed in sleep. For Cayce, the idea that the soul, when properly aligned, could ascend into higher vibrational states and return with regenerative forces was not merely symbolic or metaphorical. He viewed these phenomena as real, physiological, and repeatedly demonstrable in the lives of those who practiced disciplined spiritual preparation. In this view, the body was not merely a vessel. It was a dynamic field affected by the soul's unseen activities, particularly those that unfolded during the liminal hours of sleep. Cayce maintained that many illnesses were not born in the body, but rooted in the soul. What modern medicine might label as psychosomatic, Cayce expanded into an intricate doctrine of karmic imbalance and spiritual misalignment. He claimed that when individuals neglected their spiritual ideals or suppressed unresolved emotions, these internal tensions could impress themselves onto the physical form. Yet, just as damage could be impressed through the soul's descent into lower states of fear or confusion, so too could restoration be achieved by contact with higher realms of divine order and harmony. This restorative contact, according to his readings, often took place while the conscious mind was dormant and the soul free to travel, particularly in the early morning hours, when sleep deepened and external distractions had fully ceased. The case of Martha Robertson remains among the most astonishing. A middle-aged woman from Virginia who had been partially paralyzed following a spinal injury in her youth, Martha sought a reading from Cayce in early 1936. Her physical symptoms were complex and persistent: nerve pain, limited movement, and a curvature of the spine confirmed by physicians as degenerative. In her session, Cayce advised her not simply on diet or adjustments, which he often did, but instructed her to begin a nightly practice of mental purification. He urged her to visualize divine light traveling down her spine before sleep and to pray not merely for healing, but for clarity of purpose. For Cayce, this was not a placebo suggestion. He described it as a mechanism to align her soul with a dimension of creative force capable of catalyzing real biological repair. Over the next 6 months, Martha adhered to the regimen with a kind of spiritual discipline uncommon even among Cayce's devoted followers. She journaled her dreams and noted subtle internal shifts. Then, during a night in October, she experienced what she described as an internal warmth, unlike anything she had felt before. In a lucid, dreamlike state, she saw a tall, luminous figure place its hands on her back and utter words she could not remember but felt reverberate throughout her being. Upon waking, she discovered she could sit upright without pain. Within a week, she was walking more freely. Follow-up X-rays revealed a visible lessening of spinal curvature, and 2 doctors, neither associated with Cayce, recorded the regeneration of tissue and an easing of nerve compression that they could not explain through conventional means. This was not an isolated instance. Cayce's records contain dozens of such testimonials, cases where individuals received not only symbolic insight from dreams, but verifiable physiological changes. Some cases involved heart conditions, others digestion, and several pertained to immune-related illnesses that resolved after periods of nightly spiritual discipline. What united these cases was Cayce's claim that during sleep, the soul freed from the burdens of ego could commune with divine intelligence and absorb patterns of health that the body would then mirror upon waking. The mechanism, he often said, was attunement. A soul out of alignment filled with resentment, guilt, or fear could become vulnerable to distortions that manifest as illness. But a soul lifted through prayer, forgiveness, and the setting of a spiritual ideal could access the pattern. In the heavens, a phrase Cayce used to describe the original energetic blueprint of health. He believed this energetic template existed not in the brain but in the soul's memory, accessible through what he elsewhere called spiritual suggestion, a PAL, kind of sacred instruction given by higher beings or angelic forces during unconscious states. These suggestions did not always take the form of words, but often came as feelings, images, or inner knowing. And crucially, they required a receptive body and mind to be made manifest. One of the more intriguing examples involved a man suffering from chronic ulcers who, after months of dream journaling and nightly prayer, began to see visions of a glowing wheel turning within his stomach. In a particularly vivid sleep state, he felt the wheel stop and a hand reach in to calm the burning. Days later, his symptoms subsided. A medical reevaluation revealed substantial healing, and Cayce, in a follow-up reading, confirmed the man had made contact with what he described as a healing presence, facilitated by his own intention. And trust in the soul's journey. Dream incubation played a role in many of these reports. Individuals would pose questions before sleep, sometimes about the source of their pain, other times about what steps to take, and then receive symbolic or direct answers in their dreams. Cayce stressed that these answers came not from the subconscious alone, but from a soul accessing higher realms where truth, health, and balance resided uncorrupted. While traditional psychoanalysis might interpret these episodes as metaphor, Cayce asserted they were spiritually real. The dream state was not merely introspection, but navigation through planes of being where divine intelligence could be consulted. Yet, Cayce also warned that such healing access was not automatic. Without moral preparation, without the cleansing of anger, fear, or dishonesty, souls could become lost in lower realms and find no help. The healing, he taught, required alignment not just of thought, but of intention. One could not approach these forces with vanity or self-interest. Only humility and sincerity could draw the higher patterns into form. He likened the process to tuning a radio. The divine was always broadcasting, but only those finely tuned would hear the signal clearly, and only those with receptive instruments, bodies, and minds readied could receive the transmission fully. In this framework, the body becomes the receiver, the soul the signal seeker, and sleep the conduit through which restoration is broadcast from higher planes. Those who prepared properly through prayer, forgiveness, self-examination, and the daily reaffirmation of a spiritual ideal were those most likely to receive healing not as a miracle, but as a natural response to spiritual harmony. Thus, Cayce's teachings on physical healing did not simply emphasize curing disease, but restoring divine order within. The journey of the soul through sleep, as Edgar Cayce taught, was far more than a passive experience of rest or unconscious dreaming. It was an active pilgrimage through layers of existence, a sacred opportunity to confront and transform the burdens of past lives. Among his most compelling insights was the notion that vulnerable moments during sleep, especially the mystical hour of 3:33 am, served as gateways for the soul to engage in karmic reconciliation. This process, he explained, was not limited to isolated moments, but could unfold gradually across many nights, weaving together lessons in healing that span multiple incarnations. Cayce's readings consistently emphasized that karma was not a form of punishment but a spiritual accounting system designed for growth and eventual liberation. The debts and unresolved conflicts from previous lifetimes imprinted themselves on the soul's memory and, if left unaddressed, manifested as recurring fears, illnesses, or patterns of self-sabotage in the present. Yet, the veil that separates incarnations was thinner than commonly believed. During certain phases of sleep, the soul could re-enter these past experiences, not as a victim but as a conscious agent capable of rewriting its own story. One of the most illustrative cases involved a woman plagued by a profound fear of water that had shadowed her entire life. This phobia limited her choices. She avoided oceans, rivers, even baths. So intense was her terror that it bordered on panic. Traditional therapy yielded no lasting relief. When she sought Cayce's guidance, his readings uncovered a karmic root. In a previous life, she had drowned during a catastrophic flood, unable to escape. Her soul, Cayce explained, was still carrying the imprint of that traumatic death, its unresolved pain manifesting now as crippling fear. To heal this, Cayce advised the woman to engage in nightly spiritual work focused on revisiting the past life through dreams. She was instructed to prepare before sleep by calming her mind, offering prayers for courage, and setting an intention to face and transform the memory of the flood. Over several weeks, she began to record vivid dreams, sometimes disorienting at first, of rushing water, collapsing bridges, and faces calling out. But rather than retreating, she consciously engaged with these visions, imagining herself swimming towards safety rather than drowning, reaching for hands that pulled her up. This subtle shift in intention, Cayce explained, allowed her soul to rewrite the emotional response embedded in the karmic memory. Gradually, the grip of fear loosened. She no longer woke drenched in sweat, paralyzed by panic, but with a calm acceptance. Eventually, she found herself able to swim small distances in a pool without distress. In a follow-up reading, Cayce noted this transformation as a clear example of soul-level healing achieved through nocturnal karmic work. The past life's trauma had not vanished, but its hold had been softened by conscious reinterpretation during the vulnerable hours when the soul roams freely. This case exemplified a broader principle in Cayce's teachings, that the soul's nocturnal journeys are not random flights, but purposeful encounters with the self across time. Each dream or vision was an opportunity to confront unresolved threads and release their energetic charge. And this work was not meant to be rushed or forced. The soul, traveling through the sacred threshold at 3:33 a.m., was said to be particularly open, its silver cord unencumbered enough to explore these spiritual dimensions with greater clarity. Yet it was also vulnerable, requiring protection through spiritual discipline to avoid being overwhelmed by the intensity of such encounters. Cayce's guidance frequently included the use of prayer, meditation, and visualization before sleep, as essential preparation to safeguard the soul and foster receptivity. By setting the intention to engage with karmic lessons consciously, the soul can accelerate its growth and, in some cases, even resolve debts that might otherwise span lifetimes. This spiritual hygiene was not just theoretical but practical. It shaped how one's energy vibrated, what was encountered during soul travel, and ultimately, how healing unfolded. In another profound example, a man haunted by recurring nightmares of imprisonment and injustice was led, through Cayce's readings, to recognize a pattern rooted in a past life as a political prisoner. His soul, Cayce said, was still grappling with unresolved feelings of anger and helplessness. Through deliberate nocturnal work, prayers of forgiveness, and nightly requests for guidance, the man's dreams began to shift from terror to encounters with compassionate guides who offered perspectives on mercy and acceptance. Over time, his waking life also changed. Bitterness gave way to empathy, and the nightmares ceased. This demonstrated the intimate link between karmic reconciliation during sleep and transformation in daily existence. What is remarkable about these teachings is how they frame sleep as an ongoing workshop for spiritual evolution. Rather than seeing past lives as static relics, Cayce portrayed them as dynamic interfaces, accessible to the soul for ongoing refinement. The experiences at these vulnerable hours, when the veil thins, allow the soul to retrieve forgotten memories, re-experience unresolved emotions, and make conscious choices to release patterns that bind it to suffering. The soul is thus an active participant, not a passive victim of karma. Cayce also highlighted that this process could illuminate why certain individuals carry unexplained tendencies or affinities, skills, fears, relationships that trace back through multiple lifetimes. By bringing these subconscious threads into conscious awareness during nocturnal soul travel, people gain opportunities for healing that transcend therapy or intellectual insight. This holistic healing reaches the root causes lodged in the soul's fabric, offering release that ripples outward to affect physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. The transformative potential of such nocturnal karmic work is further underscored by Cayce's repeated assertion that spiritual growth is cumulative. Each night's journey, each conscious engagement with past lives builds upon the last. Over time, this soul-level refinement fosters what he called the unfolding of the Christ consciousness within the emergence of unconditional love, compassion, and wisdom that transcends personal history and connects the individual to universal truth. It is a process that requires patience and humility, but promises profound freedom. Moreover, the presence of protective spiritual forces during these journeys was a recurrent theme in the readings. Cayce spoke of guardian angels, ascended masters, and ministering spirits who assist the soul in navigating the sometimes turbulent waters of past life memory. Their aid is often silent but essential, shielding the soul from overwhelming despair and guiding it toward healing opportunities. The spiritual disciplines recommended before sleep prayer, visualization, and moral reflection were understood not only as self-help techniques, but as ways to invite these benevolent helpers and maintain a safe passage through the dream realms. Thus, the hour of 3:33 a.m. emerges as a critical window, both a moment of vulnerability and opportunity. Cayce warned that without spiritual preparation, the soul could become disoriented or entangled in karmic shadows. Yet with intention and discipline, this threshold became a portal for profound reconciliation, healing, and growth. The soul, traversing the past landscape during sleep, brings back gifts not only for the self, but for the living present, breaking chains that bind and opening pathways toward wholeness. This teaching resonates deeply with ancient spiritual traditions. The concept of karmic reconciliation through dream states can be found echoed in Buddhist dream yoga, where practitioners cultivate lucid awareness to confront and transform inner obstacles. Similarly, in Hinduism's understanding of reincarnation and the Akashic field, past lives influence present circumstances, and conscious engagement with these memories through meditation or dream work leads to liberation, moksha. Cayce's unique contribution was to ground these lofty ideas in concrete, repeatable practices aligned with modern spiritual inquiry. In summary, the soul's nocturnal journeys through past lives at vulnerable times like 3:33 a.m. offer a profound mechanism for karmic reconciliation. Through prayer, intention, and conscious dreaming, the soul can access memories, transform trauma, and release energetic debts that otherwise perpetuate suffering. This ongoing work accelerates spiritual evolution across lifetimes, drawing the soul closer to its highest potential, a theme that resonates throughout Cayce's vast body of work. In his extensive body of trance readings, Edgar Cayce not only revealed the mysteries of the soul's nocturnal journeys, but also provided precise methods to safeguard the soul during these vulnerable travels. The hour around 3:33 a.m., while a powerful gateway for spiritual exploration and healing, also represented a time when the soul was most susceptible to intrusion by lower entities or disruptive energies. Recognizing this, Cayce stressed that preparation and protection were not optional extras, but essential spiritual hygiene for anyone seeking to consciously navigate these realms. Central to Cayce's protective protocols was the invocation of what he called the Christ light, a radiant spiritual force embodying divine love, purity, and truth. This light, he taught, functioned as a shield, a beacon, and a purifier. The invocation was not merely a prayer, but a focused act of spiritual alignment, where the individual consciously called upon the highest source of light to envelop the body, mind, and soul. Cayce described the Christ light as a vibrational frequency that repelled negative influences and created a sanctified space through which the soul could travel safely. Importantly, this light was not restricted by dogma or creed. Rather, it was an accessible force to all who earnestly sought protection with humility and faith to engage this protection. Cayce recommended a simple yet powerful ritual immediately before sleep. The individual would sit quietly, take deep breaths to center their mind, and then mentally or verbally affirm a prayer asking for the Christ light to surround them fully, from head to toe and beyond the physical body's boundaries. This was often accompanied by the visualization of a pure white or golden light descending from above, entering the crown of the head and expanding to fill the entire room. This mental image helps shift the seeker's consciousness from the physical plane into a state of spiritual readiness. Alongside the Christ light, Cayce taught the importance of calling in one's personal spiritual guides and guardian angels. He emphasized that no soul journeyed alone and that these benevolent beings acted as protectors, guides, and counselors. To do this, individuals were encouraged to address their guides with respect and openness, inviting their presence and assistance. For the night, Cayce often suggested simple invocations such as, "I call upon my guardian spirits to surround and protect me in my travels tonight." This practice established a network of spiritual allies, reinforcing the protective barrier formed by the Christ light. Visualization rituals extended beyond simply calling in light and guides. Cayce also described a method of energetic clearing designed to cleanse the aura of residual negativity accumulated throughout the day. This involved mentally tracing one's energy field and imagining the removal of dark or heavy spots as if they were being washed away by a flowing river of light. The person was then instructed to see this light as pure, dynamic, and renewing, filling every crevice of their energetic body with vitality. This clearing was crucial for reducing vulnerability because stagnant or heavy energies were believed to attract parasitic entities during the soul's nocturnal departures. One remarkable testimony illustrating the efficacy of these protocols involved a young psychic who had struggled with frightening astral encounters. She reported frequent episodes where she felt pulled or trapped during dream states, sometimes awakening terrified and disoriented. Upon consulting Cayce's guidelines and adopting the protective methods he taught, she noticed an immediate difference. By invoking the Christ light, calling upon her spiritual guides, and performing energetic cleansing before sleep, her nightmares subsided, and she developed a sense of calm and control in her dream work. At one point, she recounted being rescued during a night journey when she felt herself slipping into a dark, oppressive space. Mentally affirming the protective light and calling her guides, she perceived a shift. The darkness receded, replaced by a soothing radiance, and she awoke peacefully shortly after. This experience reinforced for her the importance of discipline and preparation in spiritual travel. Cayce also provided specific prayers and affirmations to be used as part of the protection ritual. One such prayer he personally recommended was simple yet profound in its intention. "Let the Christ light surround me, guard me, and guide me through all my journeys. May no harm come to my soul or body, and may I be led only by love and truth." This prayer served not only as a shield, but also as a declaration of the traveler's allegiance to higher forces, creating a spiritual contract that further enhanced safety. Importantly, Cayce cautioned against reliance on mechanical or formulaic repetition without heartfelt engagement. Protection was not a magic spell to be chanted absent-mindedly, but a living act of faith and awareness. The effectiveness of the protocols depended on the seeker's sincerity, humility, and desire for spiritual alignment. Without these qualities, he warned, even the most elaborate rituals could fail to shield the soul or could even invite confusion by scattering the traveler's focus. Beyond individual practices, Cayce's teachings underscored the role of daily moral conduct in fortifying the soul's defenses. He viewed the spiritual armor built during sleep as inseparable from the life lived in waking hours. Acts of kindness, forgiveness, and integrity were not only ethical ideals, but energetic investments, increasing the soul's vibration and strengthening its ability to resist negativity during vulnerable states. In this way, the protective protocols formed a holistic system, mental, emotional, and spiritual, ensuring that the soul's nightly journeys were secure and purposeful. Another dimension of Cayce's guidance involved practical steps to create a conducive sleeping environment. He suggested that the bedroom be kept clean, free from clutter, and imbued with positive energy. Some ratings mentioned the use of natural scents like lavender to calm the mind and open spiritual channels, though he advised against relying on external aids alone. The soul's readiness and protection always took precedence. Additionally, Cayce emphasized the importance of regular sleep patterns, as erratic or disrupted sleep could weaken the soul's connection to protective energies and increase vulnerability. He also cautioned about the dangers of intentionally forcing astral projection or dream recall without proper spiritual preparation. Many seekers of psychic experiences fell prey to confusion, fear, and attacks because they underestimated the protective work required. For Cayce, the path was not about reckless exploration, but measured, reverent progress, always guarded by the Christ light and the presence of guides. Taken together, these protective methods formed a coherent system designed to empower soul travelers. By invoking the Christ light, visualizing protective energy, calling upon spiritual guides, and maintaining daily moral discipline, individuals could navigate the dream realms with greater confidence and safety. The protective protocols were not only practical tools, but spiritual disciplines that deepened one's relationship with divine forces and nurtured the soul's growth. The clarity and consistency of Cayce's guidance on protection make it particularly relevant even today. In an era of heightened interest in dreams, meditation, and astral travel, the risk of encountering disorienting or harmful experiences remains real. Cayce's legacy reminds seekers that protection is not a passive state but an active, ongoing practice requiring intention, humility, and vigilance taught by embracing these protocols. The soul traveler aligns not only with safety but with grace. The grace of moving through realms of spirit under the watchful care of love and light. In doing so, the nightly journey becomes not a source of fear but a gateway to healing, wisdom, and divine communion. As we draw our exploration to a close, it is essential to understand that 3:33 a.m. is far more than a mere number on the clock or an odd coincidence that interrupts restless sleep. According to Edgar Cayce's extensive teachings, this time represents a profound spiritual threshold, a gateway through which the soul passes to traverse unseen realms. It is a moment when the veil between worlds thins, inviting the soul to journey beyond the confines of the physical body and to engage with the vast dimensions of spirit, memory, and divine intelligence. Yet, with such opportunity comes inherent risk. The hour is a spiritual invitation fraught with vulnerability, where the unprepared soul can become exposed to unseen influences, both benign and malign. Cayce's emphasis on 3:33 a.m. is not accidental or symbolic alone. It is deeply rooted in a synthesis of ancient traditions and his unique clairvoyant insights. From the biblical third watch of the night, an hour associated with prayer, vigilance, and divine intervention, to monastic vigils where spiritual seekers kept watch in the silence of night, this time has long been recognized as sacred and potent. Cayce's voice echoes these traditions while bringing fresh clarity. The soul's journey at 3:33 a.m. is not merely about passing through time, but about crossing into a liminal space where the soul's intentions, purity, and preparedness determine the nature of its experience, reframing sleep from a simple physical necessity into a sacred spiritual practice challenges much of our modern understanding. Sleep becomes, in Cayce's paradigm, the nightly opportunity for healing, revelation, and transformation. It is not a passive withdrawal from the world, but an active engagement with the soul's growth. The hours around 3:33 a.m. are the peak of this sacred window, a time when the soul is most free to journey to the borderland, the Akashic records, or even the realm of creative forces. Here, spiritual mysteries unfold, karmic debts can be reconciled, and divine instruction is offered. However, this sacred potential demands preparation. Cayce's teachings repeatedly emphasize that entering these realms without protection or intention leaves the soul vulnerable to harmful entities and energetic disturbances. The invocation of the Christ light, the calling of spiritual guides, the clearing of negative energies, all these practices form a spiritual armor necessary to navigate safely. Beyond these rituals, the ethical dimension is paramount. A life lived with compassion, humility, and integrity increases the soul's vibrational frequency, enhancing its resilience in these vulnerable moments. Spiritual discipline during waking hours and protective preparation before sleep together ensure that the soul's nocturnal travel is both secure and fruitful. Recognizing 3:33 a.m. as a gateway rather than just a time reframes how we approach sleep itself. Rather than dreading or ignoring the mysterious waking or anxious moments at this hour, Cayce invites us to see them as signals, wake-up calls from the soul, urging us to pay attention. These moments are opportunities to cultivate awareness and develop protective and healing practices. They remind us that the spiritual realm is always near, and that our souls are active participants in a cosmic dance that extends beyond physical boundaries. The lessons from Cayce's readings also offer hope. The soul's vulnerability at 3:33 a.m. is not a condemnation, but an invitation to growth. Through disciplined spiritual practice, prayer, meditation, forgiveness, and intention setting, anyone can learn to traverse these realms with grace. Healing, guidance, and transformation become accessible, turning what might seem a moment of fear into a source of empowerment and illumination. This sacred work deepens our connection to the divine, aligns us with higher purpose, and ultimately contributes to the evolution of consciousness itself. As we contemplate this mysterious hour, it is fitting to end with Cayce's own words, which encapsulate the essence of the soul's nocturnal journey. Dreams are today's answers to tomorrow's questions. This statement reminds us that what we encounter in the vulnerable hours of sleep is not mere fantasy or random neural activity, but vital messages from the soul guidance, warnings and inspirations that shape our waking lives and future paths. The challenge remains: what will your soul do tonight when the veil lifts at 3:33 a.m.? Will you ignore the call, drifting unprepared into the unknown? Or will you embrace the spiritual invitation, preparing yourself to journey with protection, intention, and faith? The choice is yours, but the hour remains, silent yet potent, waiting. In this light, sleep transforms from a forgotten necessity into a sacred ceremony, a chorus, daily crossing point where the soul's destiny can be shaped. The mysteries of 3:33 a.m. are not to be feared, but embraced. honored as a threshold where spiritual vulnerability becomes opportunity, and where the soul's deepest work unfolds under the watchful care of divine light.